On the evening of December 10th, 2008, in a Manhattan penthouse, one of the most respected men on Wall Street sat his two sons down and told them the truth. The investment business, all of it, was, in his own words, just one big lie. His sons, Mark and Andrew, contacted federal authorities that same night. By the following morning, FBI agents were at the door of Bernard Madoff's apartment. The largest Ponzi scheme in history was over. Client account statements showed balances totaling approximately $65 billion, but the vast majority of that money had never existed. It was fiction, numbers on paper, designed to keep the machine running. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. He grew up in a middle-class family, attended the University of Alabama briefly, and then graduated from Hofstra University on Long Island. In 1960, at just 22 years old, Madoff founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. The firm operated a legitimate stock brokerage business, trading securities, making markets. On the surface, it was entirely real. Over the decades, the firm grew into a powerhouse. Madoff became one of the pioneers of electronic trading and was instrumental in developing the technology that powered modern stock markets. His reputation reached its apex when he served as chairman of the NASDAQ stock exchange. In the world of finance, there were few names that inspired more confidence than Bernie Madoff. But alongside the legitimate brokerage, Madoff ran a separate investment advisory business, and this was the operation built entirely on deception. He cultivated an air of exclusivity. Clients didn't find Madoff. Madoff found them. People begged to invest with him. He reported unusually consistent annual returns of around 10%, even when the broader market was in turmoil. The returns weren't spectacular. They were just suspiciously steady. And that, paradoxically, made them believable. Here is what investigators discovered. In the investment advisory arm of Madoff's firm, no actual securities trades were ever executed. Not one. The entire operation was a fabrication from start to finish. Investor funds were deposited into a single Chase Manhattan Bank business account, later held at J.P. Morgan Chase. Money came in from new investors and went out to existing ones. That was the entire mechanism. A textbook Ponzi scheme. To maintain the illusion, Madoff's team fabricated trade confirmations and account statements. His bookkeeper, Annette Bongiorno, reportedly generated fake trading records by looking up past stock winners in old editions of the Wall Street Journal, then inserting them as if they had been real trades. It was strikingly unsophisticated for a multi-billion-dollar fraud. The scheme succeeded not through technological complexity, but through the weight of Madoff's personal reputation and the psychology of trust. The victim list was staggering in its breadth. Wealthy individuals, charitable foundations, pension funds, hedge funds, banks, and celebrities. Some had invested their entire life savings. Others managed money on behalf of thousands of retirees who had no idea where their funds had gone. Madoff's client base eventually spanned the globe. The fraud touched investors across more than 100 countries, fed by a network of feeder funds whose managers channeled their clients' money directly into Madoff's operation. While Madoff stated in his plea allocution that the scheme began in 1991, evidence suggests the fraud may have started far earlier. At least one former employee testified to fabricating records since the early 1970s. The sentencing judge agreed with prosecutors that the fraud began at some point in the 1980s, The actual cash deposited by investors over the decades totaled approximately 17 to 20 billion dollars. The remaining tens of billions on account statements were fictitious profits, returns on investments that had never been made, a number conjured from nothing. In 1999, a financial analyst named Harry Markopoulos was working at Rampart Investment Management in Boston. His firm asked him to study Madoff's strategy and replicate its returns. Within hours, he concluded that the returns were mathematically impossible. Markopoulos first alerted the Securities and Exchange Commission in May 2000. He submitted detailed mathematical analysis showing that Madoff's reported returns could not be achieved through any legitimate trading strategy. The SEC took no meaningful action. He tried again in 2001, then again in 2005, submitting a detailed report, and again in 2007, and again in 2008. 5 separate warnings over the course of nearly a decade, each one ignored or given only cursory review. The SEC, for its part, did conduct examinations and investigations of Madoff's firm in 1999, 2000, 2004, 2005, and again in 2006 through 2007. On multiple occasions, regulators were inside the building, and yet they found nothing. The SEC's own Inspector General later concluded that a thorough and competent investigation or examination was never performed. The agency had the evidence in front of it, had a whistleblower handing them the answers, and still failed to see the fraud. Meanwhile, the 2008 global financial crisis was accelerating. Markets were collapsing. Investors everywhere were panicking and pulling their money out. Madoff's clients were no exception. They began requesting massive redemptions. Clients requested approximately $7 billion in redemptions. But when Madoff checked the account, only about $300 million remained. The scheme was insolvent. There was nowhere left to run. Facing the impossible arithmetic of his collapsing scheme, Madoff did something investigators had never prompted. He confessed voluntarily. On December 10, 2008, he told his sons Mark and Andrew that the investment advisory business was, in his words, basically a giant Ponzi scheme. His sons immediately contacted a lawyer who advised them to report the confession to federal authorities. Within hours, the FBI was notified. The fraud that regulators had failed to uncover for decades was brought to light, not by any investigation, but by the perpetrator's own family. FBI agents arrested Bernard Madoff at his Manhattan apartment on December 11, 2008. When agents arrived, Madoff reportedly acknowledged that there was no innocent explanation for what had happened. In the weeks and months that followed, a team of nearly 15 FBI special agents, along with financial analysts and law enforcement partners, began the monumental task of examining every document in Madoff's offices. They interviewed hundreds of victims and traced the flow of money through years of fabricated records. The goal was not just to prove what Madoff had done. That was already clear. It was to determine who else had helped him do it. Frank DePascali, Madoff's chief financial officer and right-hand man, pleaded guilty to 10 federal charges in 2009 and became a cooperating witness. His testimony would prove essential in identifying and prosecuting the employees who had helped maintain the fraud for decades. On March 12, 2009, Bernard Madoff stood in a federal courtroom and pleaded guilty to 11 felonies, including securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. He waived his right to a trial. On June 29, 2009, Judge Denny Chin sentenced Madoff to 150 years in federal prison, the maximum possible sentence. Judge Chin noted that the crimes were, in his words, off the charts. Madoff's brother Peter, who had served as the firm's chief compliance officer, pleaded guilty and received a 10-year prison sentence. De Pascali, the cooperating witness, died of lung cancer in May 2015 before he could be sentenced. 5 former employees, Daniel Bonventre, Annette Bongiorno, Joanne Krupi, Jerome O'Hara, and George Perez, went to trial and were convicted in March 2014. They had helped fabricate the records that made the fraud possible. Madoff was transferred to Federal Medical Center Butner in North Carolina. He would spend the rest of his life behind those walls. On April 14, 2021, at the age of 82, Bernard Madoff died in prison, having served approximately 12 years of his sentence. The single largest recovery in the case came from the estate of investor Jeffrey Picower, a settlement of $7.2 billion in December 2010, which was at the time the largest single forfeiture in American judicial history. The Madoff case reshaped how America thinks about financial regulation. The SEC was forced into sweeping reforms after its Inspector General laid bare the agency's failure. A whistleblower had given them everything they needed, and they had done nothing. For the victims, the devastation was profound. Elderly retirees lost everything. Charitable foundations that served vulnerable communities were forced to close. The ripple effects touched tens of thousands of lives across the globe. But the recovery effort that followed was extraordinary. Court-appointed trustee Irving Picard pursued aggressive clawback lawsuits, recovering and distributing nearly $14 billion to former Madoff customers over the following years. The Department of Justice's Madoff Victim Fund, administered by former SEC Chairman Richard Breeden, distributed over $4.3 billion to more than 40,000 victims across 127 countries. Combined with Picard's recoveries, over 90% of proven cash losses were ultimately returned. The Madoff scandal remains a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust in financial markets and about what happens when the institutions designed to protect us fail to do their job. One man's reputation and an entire system's complacency made it possible for a fraud to endure for decades in plain sight. Harry Markopolos spent nearly a decade trying to stop Bernie Madoff. He warned the SEC 5 times. No one listened, until Madoff himself ran out of money and confessed. A new case drops every day. Subscribe so you never miss one.